The men unloading wedding chairs had already pulled my spray lane markers out of the ground and tossed them into a coffee can beside the gate. One of them asked if the faded paint lines across the field could be covered before sunset photos. Another crew parked a catering trailer beside the nutrient tank because they thought the gravel pad was unused utility space. Nobody talked like they were trespassing. That was the part that kept throwing me off. The HOA had apparently told vendors the farm was cleared for temporary event use. But when I called the county office, the parcel number attached to the approval didn't belong to my field. It belonged to the drainage strip beside the road. Meanwhile, the nutrient spray cycle for Saturday morning was already armed inside my pump shed, and people were still rolling. White aisle carpet directly across the boom path. The first white chair landed on the spray lane marker before I had finished rinsing nutrient residue off my gloves. It was a small plastic flag orange, once faded almost pink from sun. We used them to mark where the rotating arms cleared the low part of the north flat. Whoever unloaded the chairs had pulled 3 of them up and stuck them in a coffee can by the gate. I stood beside the mix tank with one glove still on, watched 2 men in black polo shirts carry a stack of folding chairs across the field. My wife had spent 6 years bringing back from flood damage. Behind them, a woman in a headset pointed toward the soybean rows and said, "The ceremony line needs to face the sunset." I stood there long enough to see the problem was not the chairs. They were confused about what a farm was. My name is Graham Mercer. I am 61 years old and I run the last 68 acres of Mercer Flats that did not become Arden Ridge Estates. My wife Lorna restored the North Field after the 2011 washout. She fought clay and county delays for 6 summers, then died before the second clean harvest. I still walk the spray lines myself because she used to say buried systems only stay honest if somebody remembers where they are. Celeste Arden remembered none of that. She was the HOA president across the road. And by Wednesday morning, her daughter's wedding had already started moving onto my land. Not the wedding itself yet, just the things people bring before they admit the thing is real. Chairs, platform panels, rolled white carpet, rented lights, floral crates. I told the first crew lead they were on an active nutrient application zone. He nodded like I had told him there might be mosquitoes. Mrs. Arden said the field was cleared for temporary event use, he said, checking a tablet. We're only here through Sunday. Those flags are not decorations. He looked back at the coffee can by the gate. We can put them somewhere visible after layout. I remember staring at him longer than I meant to. Not because I was angry. Because he had said after layout as if the field had agreed to wait. The application cycle was already loaded into the timer cabinet in my pump shed. Saturday at 6:40 a.m., 2,000 gallons of liquid nutrient mix would begin moving through the boom lines on the north flat. It was not a dramatic system. It was seasonal work tanks, hoses, pressure checks, wine readings. The kind of thing nobody noticed unless it went wrong. By noon, Celeste sent a message through the HOA portal, not to me directly, but to the whole neighborhood. Grateful for community cooperation as we create a beautiful shared memory on the historic farm frontage. Historic farm frontage. That was what she called working land when it needed to look pretty in photographs. I called the county zoning desk and got transferred twice. The second woman found a temporary access note attached to the Arden Ridge event file, but the parcel number she read back was not mine. It belonged to the drainage strip beside the road. When I told her that, she went quiet and said somebody would call me back. Nobody did. That afternoon, more chairs arrived. The spray lane flag stayed in the coffee can. A vendor's trailer parked close enough to the tank pad that I had to turn my truck around in the ditch. I walked to the pump shed before dark and opened the timer cabinet. The green light blinked beside Saturday's cycle, armed. I pressed the cover shut and stood there with one hand on it while laughter drifted from the field. For the first time, the problem stopped feeling rude. It felt scheduled. By Thursday morning, the wedding had a hashtag. Hashtag Arden Ridge. Ever After was printed on a chalkboard sign leaning against my fence next to a crate of white umbrellas and 2 buckets of eucalyptus stems. Someone had tied cream ribbon around the gate latch. The same latch I had welded back on after the 2017 flood bent it sideways. I cut the ribbon off with my pocket knife and put it on the hood of the rental truck parked in front of the tank pad. A young woman with a clipboard saw me. She came over quickly but not angrily. That almost made it worse. "Mr. Mercer, we're trying to keep this area camera ready," she said. "This area feeds the north boom line." She checked her clipboard. "I was told the farm equipment would be inactive for the weekend." I asked who told her that. She glanced back toward the field where 4 men were rolling white carpet over the faded yellow spray radius paint. One had already pulled up another marker flag and tucked it under his arm like trash. Mrs. Arden said all agricultural activity had been accommodated. Accommodated. That word kept showing up whenever somebody wanted work in land to behave like rented scenery. I walked past her and checked the coupling behind the nutrient tank. The trailer beside it was close enough that I had to turn my shoulders to reach the valve. If a pressure line kicked during startup, I would not have room to shut it down cleanly. I told the crew lead that. He listened with the expression of a man being asked to choose between safety and a deposit he could not refund. "We're already staged," he said. "The planner has us locked until Saturday. Then unlock yourself from my tank pad." He smiled because he thought I was making a joke. When I did not smile back, he stopped. By lunch, the neighborhood group chat had screenshots of me cutting the ribbon. My daughter Mara sent one without comment, then called 3 minutes later. "Dad, people are saying you're threatening to spray chemicals on a wedding. It's nutrient mix. That is not going to sound better online." I looked out the kitchen window. 2 florists were setting buckets in the shade of my pump shed because it was the only cool spot near the field. "I am not threatening anybody," I said. The cycle was filed before their wedding was planned. Mara went quiet. She had her mother's way of letting silence ask the question. Finally, she said, "Have you told the bride no? Why not?" "Because her mother should have. Because I did not want to be the old widower who scared a 26-year-old woman 2 days before her wedding. Because part of me still believed a reasonable adult would stop this before I had to explain spray drift to a bride holding a CT chart. I said, "Not yet." That afternoon, the first vendor hesitated. It was the flooring contractor. He stood at the edge of the field with his invoice folder against his chest, looking from the carpet to the spray arms mounted low along the surface strip. "Are those live?" he asked. "Yes." He lowered his voice. "They told us decorative irrigation." I almost laughed. The whole thing was starting to sound like people translating danger into wedding language until it stopped being danger. Before he left, he moved 2 pallets 3 feet away from the boom path. Not far enough to matter. Far enough to prove he was worried. At dusk, Celeste posted another message. "Some neighbors are struggling with the spirit of shared community this week. We ask everyone to lead with grace." 27 people liked it. No one from Arden Ridge knocked on my door. At 8:10, I went back to the pump shed and found a strip of white aisle carpet laid across the access trench. The spray arms tested at 5:30 Friday evening while a string quartet rehearsed 40 yards away. The quartet had set up beneath the unfinished reception tent on the north flat. Soft music drifted over the fields, while one of my outer boom lines rotated through a low-pressure calibration cycle near the service trench. Not enough to spray yet. Just enough movement to check the arm timing before dawn activation the next day. One violinist stopped playing when she noticed the metal arm turning slowly through the grass. "What is that?" she asked nobody in particular. A rental worker answered before I could. "Farm irrigation. Not wrong. Not correct either." The arm rotated another 6 feet, paused, then locked back into standby position with a dull hydraulic click. The music resumed after a few seconds, thinner than before. I spent most of Friday moving between practical problems that should not have existed together. Half the North Flat was becoming a wedding venue, while the other half still needed to function like a farm before sunrise Saturday. Every solution created another obstruction. The catering generators blocked one hose route. The dance floor covered the secondary trench access. Someone had parked decorative whiskey barrels directly beside the nutrient transfer line. By afternoon, I had started rerouting equipment around wedding infrastructure, instead of the other way around. I rerouted the hose twice before admitting I had done it around their tables. I was checking wind drift on the western edge when Mara pulled into the field access road. She got out without shutting off the engine. "You look awful," she said. "I'm busy. You're pacing holes into the grass." I looked down. She was right. The same stretch beside the pump shed had gone muddy from my boots. Mara followed my eyes toward the reception tent. "They're still going through with this. Looks that way. Dad, at what point does somebody stop them?" I almost answered immediately. Then didn't. Because I did not know who was supposed to be in charge anymore. The county stopped returning calls that morning. Celeste kept posting cheerful updates online about rehearsal dinner arrivals. Vendors had started asking cautious questions, but not enough to pull out publicly. Even the people getting nervous were trying to stay emotionally adjacent to the wedding instead of separate from it. Nobody wanted to become the person who ruined it. That evening, the florist came looking for me near the tank shed. Same woman from Thursday. Her shoes were muddy now. "Can I ask you something? Honestly," she said. "Sure." If this thing runs tomorrow, how bad is it? The question sat between us longer than it should have. Behind her, workers were hanging white fabric from the tent frame, while another crew tested overhead lights. The fabric moved gently every time the breeze shifted east. That depends on the wind, I said finally. She looked toward the fabric too, then back at the spray arms. When were you planning to tell everybody? I assumed somebody already had. She stopped looking at the spray arms after that. Around sunset, one of the flooring contractors quietly started removing panels from the outer edge of the north strip. Not many. Just enough to protect his equipment trailer if things turned ugly. Nobody announced it publicly. He simply changed priorities while pretending not to. An hour later, Celeste arrived in a golf cart with 2 HOA board members behind her. She climbed out smiling too quickly. I'm hearing you're frightened vendors now. I answered a question. You keep describing this like some disaster scenario. It's an active nutrient cycle. It's a farm, she snapped. Not a chemical plant. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably when she said chemical. People had started reacting to different words now. Nutrient, chemical, spray, drift. Nobody agreed on the scale of the problem anymore, which somehow made the atmosphere worse. Celeste lowered her voice before speaking again. You are not going to humiliate my daughter over a scheduling dispute. Scheduling dispute. I looked past her toward the reception tent glowing softly against the dark field. Workers were still adjusting tables beneath it while the spray arms sat motionless in the grass beyond the lights. You still think this is about the schedule, I said. She held my stare for a second like she wanted to answer. Then she looked away first. Later that night, I reopened the timer cabinet in the pump shed and checked the dawn sequence again. 6:40 a.m. armed. Outside rehearsal, music drifted faintly across the fields, while the wind pushed east through the tent fabric. The bride found the spray maps because somebody had used them to level a folding table. I walked into the barn office just after sunrise Saturday and saw 3 laminated drift charts spread beneath one corner of a catering setup. Coffee rings sat over the western wind calculations. A half-open makeup case rested on top of the nutrient timing forms. The bride was standing there alone holding one of the maps with both hands. Not angry. Not crying either. Just reading carefully in a room that had finally become too quiet. "You're Graham Mercer?" she asked when I stepped inside. I nodded. Behind her, the barn doors were open toward the north flat. Workers still moved through the reception tent, carrying trays and folded linens into place. From a distance, the wedding almost looked normal again, which somehow made the room feel stranger. She lifted the map slightly. My mother said this was decorative irrigation. It is irrigation. That is not the same thing. No point arguing with that. She looked back down at the laminated chart. Colored arcs spread across the field diagram showing projected nutrient drift under different wind conditions. Someone from county agriculture had initialed the bottom corner 9 years earlier. When does this start? She asked. 6:40. Her eyes moved immediately toward the clock above the workbench. 6:03. Outside, I heard a generator kick near the catering tent. The bride pressed her lips together for a second, like she was deciding which version of the morning she still had time to believe. Why didn't anyone stop this earlier? I almost answered automatically because nobody wanted to ruin a wedding. Instead, I said, people kept assuming somebody else had already checked. A few minutes later, she followed me outside while workers crossed the field carrying stacks of white chairs toward the ceremony lane. Some guests had already started arriving early for photographs. One older couple walked directly across the faded spray radius paint without noticing it at all. The bride watched them silently. Then she asked, "Can it be delayed?" I looked toward the pump shed before answering. Not safely. She did not ask for the technical explanation. Across the field, two vendors were arguing quietly beside a trailer. One of them kept pointing toward the spray arms. The other shook his head without looking over. Nobody was speaking confidently anymore. Even Celeste had changed tone. She was moving quickly between groups instead of standing still long enough for questions. Every conversation ended with some version of, "We're handling it." But handling it had started meaning different things to different people. Around 6:15, Mara pulled into the access road and stopped beside the trench. She got out holding her phone. "People are posting that the venue changed," she said. "But half the guests are still coming here because the update link crashed." The bride turned toward her immediately. "What update link?" Mara hesitated when she realized who she was talking to. "Oh," she said quietly. Nobody spoke for a second. Then the bride laughed once through her nose. Not because anything was funny, more because embarrassment had finally outrun confusion. Across the North Flat, a photographer was still arranging family members beneath the floral arch while workers removed table settings from only half the reception area. Half the field was packing up while the other half still posed for photos like nothing had changed yet. At 6:22, one of the flooring contractors began loading equipment onto his trailer without waiting for instructions. He avoided eye contact with everybody while he worked. Another vendor followed him 10 minutes later. Not fast enough to clear the field, just fast enough to spread nervousness. Celeste finally approached us beside the service trench. Her makeup looked rushed now. She stopped when she saw the bride holding the drift map. For the first time all week, Celeste looked tired instead of socially polished. "We moved the ceremony," she said quickly. "Most people already know." The bride stared at her. "Then why are guests still parking on his farm?" Celeste opened her mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Behind us, the timer cabinet inside the pump shed clicked once as the next stage armed automatically. Everybody near the trench heard it. No one asked what the sound meant. The first spray hit the floral arch before most people understood the system had actually started. At 6:40 exactly, the north boom line released with a heavy metallic shudder somewhere beyond the reception tent. Not dramatic at first, just a deep hydraulic thump rolling through the field, while guests kept crossing the grass carrying coffee cups and garment bags. For maybe 3 seconds, nothing visibly changed. Then the thin gray mist pushed sideways through the morning air. One of the photographers noticed it first. She lowered her camera and frowned toward the spray lane while still backing guests into position beneath the arch. The mist drifted low across the field instead of upward like lawn sprinklers. It moved horizontally with the wind slow enough at first that people kept trying to interpret it as something harmless. I was standing beside the pump shed watching the pressure gauge stabilize when somebody near the tent laughed and said, "Oh, good, they turned the cooling system on." A second later, the smell reached them. Not overwhelming immediately. Wet earth, fertilizer salts, organic nutrient concentrate. Familiar to anyone who worked farmland. Completely wrong for a wedding. The reaction spread unevenly. Some guests stepped away instantly. Others stayed frozen because nobody else around them seemed fully alarmed yet. One older man wiped residue off his jacket sleeve and kept talking mid-sentence before realizing what he had touched. The mist thickened as the second arm rotated into alignment. Across the field, white aisle fabric darkened in irregular streaks. Chair covers absorbed spray differently depending on the wind angle. One side of the reception tent stayed mostly untouched, while the outer seating rows took the full drift pattern almost immediately. That unevenness made the panic worse. People kept looking toward unaffected sections of the venue, trying to decide whether the problem was temporary. By the time the third boom line activated, the field had split into different emotional reactions, moving at different speeds. Some guests ran towards their cars. Some began filming. One woman accused the catering staff of triggering irrigation accidentally. Another started yelling at the photographer for continuing to take pictures while her dress was getting stained. Near the trench, two vendors argued over whether equipment damage counted as weather liability. Nobody fully agreed on what was happening. The bride stood near the access road, holding her shoes in one hand while mist drifted across the lower half of her dress. She looked less shocked than exhausted, like her embarrassment had simply arrived faster than everyone else's. Celeste kept trying to manage individual conversations instead of the situation itself. "Please stay calm. We're moving everyone uphill. It's only one section." But every sentence became outdated before she finished saying it. The wind shifted east, harder around 6:47. That was when the drift crossed fully into the reception area. Several guests screamed, then finally loud enough for the entire field to react at once. Tables overturned unevenly as people dragged chairs through wet grass trying to get clear of the spray path. One generator stalled after moisture soaked the extension junction near the catering lane, and half the decorative lights snapped off beneath the tent. The quartet abandoned their instruments without packing them. One violin remained lying in the mud beside the dance flooring, while spray drift moved over the strings in thin gray lines. I stayed near the pump controls because shutting the sequence down halfway through pressure release could rupture the outer hose assembly. Even then, my hands kept hesitating over the valves longer than they normally would have. Not because I wanted the wedding destroyed, because too many people were still inside the spray radius, moving unpredictably. At 6:52, the flooring contractor who had started removing panels the night before climbed into his truck and drove out without speaking to anybody. Several guests followed the movement instinctively, as if leaving behind another vehicle made the disaster feel officially real. By the time the final boom line completed rotation, the reception tent looked emotionally abandoned. before it was physically empty. White fabric hung damp and uneven from the support frames. Flower arrangements had collapsed sideways into the mud. Half the guests were gone already. The ones still standing mostly avoided looking directly at each other. Near the surface trench, Celeste finally stopped trying to talk. She stood beside the ruined aisle carpet with nutrient residue spotted across the front of her jacket, while county trucks turned slowly onto the access road. Nobody on the field looked relieved when they arrived. By Monday afternoon, most of the wedding was gone except for the parts nobody wanted to touch. The rental company removed the soaked dance flooring first, then the chairs, then the tent frames. Trucks kept backing across the north access road while workers avoided looking toward the field itself longer than necessary. But the spray residue stayed visible in patches across the grass where the nutrient mix had dried unevenly over the weekend. So did the tire ruts. So did the argument nobody in Arden Ridge wanted to repeat out loud anymore. I was replacing one of the outer hose couplings when a landscaping crew arrived to remove the floral arch supports. The same two men who had unloaded white chairs earlier in the week worked mostly in silence now. One of them stopped beside the trench and asked quietly, "You running another cycle this week Thursday?" I said. He nodded once and moved the support cart farther from the spray lane without being told. Across the neighborhood, people had started changing behavior in small practical ways instead of dramatic ones. Residents stopped parking near the north fence for evening walks. The HOA discussion board went almost completely quiet, except for insurance updates and contractor complaints. Nobody reposted wedding photos anymore. The only thing that still spread normally online was blame. Some guests claimed the county approved everything improperly. Some blamed Celeste directly. A few insisted the farm should have shut the system down regardless of regulations. Most people settled on versions that made themselves sound less involved. Mara came by Tuesday morning carrying coffee and a printout from a local Facebook group. Someone had uploaded drone footage of the spray drifting across the reception tent. The comments underneath kept arguing about whether the guests had been warned early enough. She folded the pages back together before handing them to me. "You reading this stuff?" "Not much. That's probably healthy." I set the coupling wrench down beside the trench. "What happened to the bride?" Mara shrugged. "Ceremony got moved to a hotel ballroom outside town. Small group only." I nodded because I did not have anything useful to add. No dramatic cancellation, no emotional public statement. Just the wedding shrinking quietly into something people could finish without cameras pointed at it. Before leaving, Mara looked out toward the north flat where fresh grass already pushed through the damaged soil near the spray arms. "Mom would have hated this," she said. I waited a second before answering. She would have hated the wedding on the field. Mara looked back toward the spray arms once before getting in the truck. By sunset, the field looked operational again from a distance. Tanks secured, hose lines reset, marker flags back in place. Only one thing still looked wrong. A strip of stained white aisle fabric had wrapped itself tightly around the outer spray arm during the cycle Saturday morning. I climbed the service berm, unwound the fabric carefully from the metal joint, and dropped it into the back of the utility cart beside my tools. Then I restarted the rotation test for Thursday's application cycle and walked the edge of the field while the boom arm moved slowly through the evening grass behind me. 3 weeks later, the county finally updated the event authorization record. Not publicly, just a corrected parcel attachment added to the digital file with a short note about improper temporary use interpretation. The drainage strip and the north flat were separated clearly now. Somebody had also added a permanent restriction warning onto the agricultural overlay map. Nobody from Arden Ridge mentioned the update directly, but the neighborhood changed around it anyway. The HOA stopped advertising the farm frontage and listing photos. The walking trail beside my fence stayed mostly empty after sunset. When contractors came through the area after that, they asked where the spray lanes were before unloading anything. Celeste resigned from the events committee without announcing it formally. The monthly HOA meeting minutes described it as a personal scheduling adjustment. No one corrected the wording. I saw her once after that at the hardware store. We both reached for the same box of utility stakes near the garden aisle. She let go first without saying anything, then moved farther down the shelf pretending to compare prices. By early fall, the grass had grown back over most of the damaged tire tracks. The spray arms rotated normally again every Thursday morning. A few residents still complained online whenever the nutrient drift carried across the road. But now the complaints sounded careful, like people checking who might read them later. Last week, a county inspector stapled a laminated warning marker beside the access trench. They put it exactly where the wedding arch used to stand. The new marker already had dirt on the corners.